the setting sun, I will praise your name. Your great is your faithfulness to me. Oh, though the earth may pass away, your word remains the same, yeah. And history can prove there's nothing you can't do. You are faithful and true. Though the storms may come and the winds may blow, I'll remain steadfast and let my heart learn when you speak a word, it will come to
Church, good morning. Welcome to Church Online. Today is going to be very different. Obviously, we're one chapter through the book of Philippians, and to this point, I've been pretty clear that we were going to put a pin in our Philippians series once we got to the Christmas season. However, I also know we wanted to get through chapter 1, and so last week we finished chapter 1 of the book of Philippians. We're going to pick up in chapter 2 in 2021 because we're going to need to focus on joy, and we're going to make sure we go through that whole book. However, I'm not ready to start our Christmas sermon series yet, so this weekend is what I like to call a one-off message. It's not tied to last week. It's not tied to next week. It's a standalone message where I'm going to read to you something from God's Word that's been on my heart, something I've been working through, and really this morning, I'm going to begin talking to you about something that I'm focused and poised to spend more time looking into in 2021. This week, we got together with some family, spent some time with those who came through Thanksgiving, and we were just talking about how different Thanksgiving was. As a matter of fact, I was talking with a guy in our church. He spent Thanksgiving alone. Nobody, he couldn't visit his family because they were in California. He had a meal by himself on that Thursday. And since he told me that, I've been bothered and burdened about that, and I began thinking through my Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving has always been my favorite holiday because it's not been over-commercialized. It's not about gifts and toys and buying stuff. It's completely focused on a simple but wholesome meal around the table with family, celebrating what we're thankful for. My Thanksgiving was different this year than any other year. There was some family I couldn't see, some family I didn't get to see. I had some family down with COVID who couldn't even travel to their close family gathering. On top of that, my grandparents are in an assisted living facility, and so we couldn't gather with them like we have in years gone by. And so I got the privilege of praying over my small family gathering because I was the oldest pastor in attendance. And usually, I'm like the third, fourth, or fifth oldest. I have a lot of pastors in my family. And I'm always honored to pray at our family Thanksgiving, but my heart has been burdened with that. But also, I have a friend who, for a week now, has been in ICU battling COVID. I also thought about some of my friends who gathered this year around the Thanksgiving table. One of my closest friends, his brother died this year of COVID. And so this Thanksgiving, for the last few days, I have been kind of burdened and bothered and mourning the loss and the hurt and the pain of this year, and it's been hard to be grateful. But I was on Twitter one afternoon, and somebody was talking about how difficult they were, how much difficulty they were having being thankful this year. And another Christian, it was a Christian tweeting, another Christian responded to them and said, hey, listen, sometimes when we can't have joyful Thanksgiving meals with lots of kids laughing and celebrating, sometimes silent gratitude is powerful. And I have been thinking about that over and over and how silent gratitude, what that looks like in our lives. But I've also been burdened because I have heard this little bit of noise in the church and in many Christians' hearts. And what we tend to do is when hard things happen, whether they be a crisis in our life or a crisis in our marriage or a crisis in our health or a pandemic like what we're currently living through, what we as Christians sometimes tend to do is we tend to tell people, don't worry, it'll be okay. Just have joy, just have hope, just have faith, get over it, don't worry about it, don't cry about it. And in the meantime, we overlook, we pass by people who are mourning and hurting. And my heart has been burdened and hurting this year since March. There are friends I have not gotten to see this year, and I have not preached really a message like I'm about to preach to you all year long. I have been hope-filled, and I am still hope-filled. I have been focused on joy, and I am still focused on joy. I have been doing my best to hold on to the good news in the midst of all the bad news. But this morning, I want to do my best to focus our attention on mourning and lamenting and what that looks like for a Christian, because here's what I'm afraid has happened. I'm afraid many Christians have bought into a false theology that once we get saved, we only ever have joy and we don't know what mourning is. And therefore, we don't know how to do it. And when hard things happen, we just tell people to get over it or get through it. And we don't know how to biblically mourn. Yet when I read through the Old Testament, I find Job mourning in the midst of his difficulty. He still had hope, but he was mourning. And I find in Lamentations, which I'm going to read from in just a second, a book written about a people who were mourning but still held on to their hope. In the New Testament, we find believers who were persecuted, and yet they held on to their joy, but also there were seasons of mourning when somebody like Peter was martyred, when Paul lost his life, when Timothy faced hardship. They knew how to mourn, but they also knew how to celebrate. And I'm afraid that we as Christians have done this. We've said when you get saved, it's only joy. We come to service, and every service is better than the next service, and it's always joy-filled, and everything's up and to the right. And we've allowed the American culture to tell us that unless something is up and to the right, it's not good. However, life is not up and to the right. There are highs and there are lows. There are mountaintops and there are valleys. And if we as Christians don't know how to mourn well, then we don't know how to live well. And so the Bible doesn't just gloss over mourning. We tend to avoid the passages that deal with mourning because for most of us, we believe life should always be joy-filled and happy and never have any hardship. And yet when we attend a funeral, we don't know how to respond. When our business burns to the ground, we don't know what to do. See, we have this theology of how to do what's right when we're given much, but we don't know what to do when things are taken from us, when we're hurting, when we're in pain. And so with that in mind this year, I've been focused and really trying to figure out what that looks like. And next year, I'm working on a series of how to mourn properly. What does mourning look like? How do we know when we're mourning well? What does the Bible say about mourning? Not just that there is a season for mourning, but what does it look like? How do we come around people who are mourning and help them and help those who are hurting? But this morning, I'm going to do my best to give you a 10,000-foot view, a cursory overview of the book of Lamentations. I'm going to read you a few passages. Not all of them will be on the screen. Chapter 3 and chapter 5 will be on the screen for you. But first, I'm going to read to you from chapter 1 and really set the setting of Lamentations. This is a book written for those who are lamenting, those who are mourning. And we most believe it was Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, who wrote this book. He had a sad perspective. He wasn't the preacher who got everybody hyped up. He was the preacher who came in and said, we have bad news. There are some things we need to mourn. In chapter 1 and verse 1, he puts it this way. He says, how lonely the city that was full of people. He's speaking to Jerusalem. He says, the streets are empty, and what's left is pain. He says in verse 2, she weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks among all her lovers. She has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. In the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah is writing to a group of people who have been taken into bondage by the Babylonians. The Babylonians invaded, they killed, they tortured, they raped, they stole, and they took the best people away into bondage in Babylon. And all that are left are either wounded, hurting, some are sick, some are widows, some are orphans. They're the leftovers of society. And so this beautiful city of Jerusalem is now laid in waste. And Jeremiah is writing to a people who did not find themselves like Job in a tragedy of someone else's making. They didn't find themselves in tragedy because of outside influences. They found themselves in tragedy because of things they had done. And the Bible records for us in verse 5, because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. There were many steps the people of God took away from the Lord, doing what was wrong, and God kept warning them over and over. He said, don't worship other gods. They began worshiping other gods. Not just other gods, they began worshiping gods that required human sacrifice. They began worshiping gods that required adulterous affairs on the offering table in their temples. They began worshiping filthy other gods that required nasty relationships between brothers and sisters. I mean, you name it, they did it in the name of false gods. Verse 8 of chapter 1 says, Jerusalem sinned grievously, and therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. They've seen who she really is. She herself groans. In the Hebrew writing, often when there's 5 chapters, and there are 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations, if there's 5 verses or 5 phrases, usually it goes like this. The writer will set the stage in the first one, the first letter, the first chapter, the first phrase. It will progressively get worse, but then in the third, the middle, that is the one where the climax will be. And in chapter 3, we're going to find our main text. Chapter 4, there'll be a crescendo. And then chapter 5, there's the main takeaway. What happens next? Where does this story go? So in chapter 2, he begins describing how the city was laid waste, how there was no pity, how they cry for their mothers. They have no food. They have no bread. Young men and old women are dying in the street. It's awful. But then in chapter 3 of the book of Lamentations, again, a quick overview, we find a nugget of encouragement. We find a little passage where he's laid all the hopelessness out before him, and he even says, I've lost my hope as a human, and yet I hold on to this hope for God. Read with me in chapter 3 of Lamentations, beginning in verse 17. It says, my soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. He says, I have forgotten what happiness is. I don't have any more hope. I've run out. Verse 19, he says, remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But, he says, but this I call to mind. He says, everything is terrible, everything is sad, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Verse 22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. It's a song we sang this morning under the tent. Great is your faithfulness to me. This is a reflection of not only the Psalms, but even the Proverbs. His mercies are new every morning, every day. He says, the steadfast love encourages me. Verse 24, the Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. He says, I have no more hope in our armament. I have no more hope in our city walls. I have no more hope in anything here. All I have left to hope on is the Lord. He is my portion. Therefore, I will hope in him. And then I notice this phrase, the Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. Remember I said that silent gratitude, that patient waiting. Often when we find ourselves in a season of mourning, there's this idea of waiting patiently and quietly. He says in verse 26, it is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. I want to make some things clear. We may not be going through what we're going through as a result of sin. These people were, and yet they were called to silent mourning and a silent, patient waiting on the Lord. They weren't beating their chest. They were quietly waiting. They were quietly mourning. But even in their mourning, in chapter 3, we see that they have this nugget of hope in the midst of their mourning. And this is what set them apart from unbelievers. This is what set them apart from people who worshiped false gods. Once a false god was cast down, broken at the altar, people just moved on and they found another god to worship. But the people of God still had this hope. And this is what sets us apart in our mourning. So if you're mourning today over something outside of your control, or even if you're mourning like these people over sin that led to consequences that you don't enjoy, you can have hope in the Lord because his mercies are new every single day. I know people who not only have hope because of eternity, have hope because of what they have to look forward to, they have hope because God has used even their past mistakes to minister and care and encourage those around them. And then in chapter 5, he really wraps up what this all looks like and how it should play out. Chapter 5 and verse 19, he puts it this way, but you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. This is the closing of the book of Lamentations. The next verse 20, why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? He says, I know this isn't forever, but it feels like forever. He knows that God will come back. He knows that they will be restored. But notice how he puts it in verse 21, restore us to yourself, O Lord. Don't restore us to our former glory. Don't restore us to our former wealth, our freedom, our power, our land, our temple. Restore us to you, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. I want you to get a hold of this. He doesn't say, God, give us back everything that's been taken away. I hope this morning you aren't saying, God, just get us back to where we were. But I hope through this season of difficulty, whether it's COVID related, whether it's financial, whether you've been laid off, whether it's in your relationship with your spouse, I hope your goal is to draw closer to the Lord, because once I'm restored to God, all these other things begin to work themselves out. You say, Pastor Mark, well, that doesn't sound right. That's because we love having lists and numbers and, man, do these 10 steps, eat these 3 things, say these 5 things at work. If you do these 4 steps, you'll get a raise. No, listen, if we can be restored into the Lord, suddenly we will not only be drawn closer to the Lord, we will be full of the Holy Spirit. We will have the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, long-suffering, the things against which there are no law, right? And when we have those, suddenly when I'm patient, my relationship begins to improve. Suddenly when I'm kind, my relationship with my coworkers begins to improve. Suddenly, the more I'm like Jesus, the more I'm restored to God, these other things that I've been worrying about and fretting over begin to heal. Now, let's not make any mistakes here. There's hope, but there's still mourning over what's been lost. Some of you, your goal is not to get back to work. Your goal is not just to have things the way they were. You're missing someone. I've got friends this year who had empty seats at their Thanksgiving table because their family members died this year from COVID. I'm not talking about people I don't know. I could name their names. People a year ago that were healthy. People that I've known my whole lives who are dead. I've got a friend right now, I've been praying for him for a week. He's been in ICU with COVID in Chesapeake, and I've been praying desperately for him. Couldn't attend Thanksgiving with his family. My heart breaks for him. And it's with that in mind that I want to know how to mourn, but I also want to know how to help those who are mourning. And so I want you to understand a couple things this morning. Number one, I want you to understand that mourning is natural. When we get saved, we aren't just delivered from bad seasons or hard times. We need to learn how to mourn, but mourn with hope. See, years ago, I lost a cousin of mine to a tragic accident. And when we attended the funeral together, there were some people there who didn't know him but knew of his death. One of them was at the scene of the accident. And when he showed up, he was blown away with how my cousin's family was hope-filled and hopeful in the midst of such a terrible tragedy. He was 25 years old when he died. And this man was moved to tears, and he pulled an uncle of mine aside and said, "What is this? How do these people act this way? How can they be so hope-filled when their son is dead?" And my uncle had the opportunity to explain to him that we have a hope in heaven, and we're not just saying goodbye forever, it's goodbye for right now, and we're going to see him again in heaven, and that gets us through. And it doesn't just give us like comfort, it gives us great joy and a hope knowing this is not forever. There's more to life than what we see here. And when we mourn, like the book of Lamentations, we have that nugget in chapter 3 that says our hope is in the Lord. His faithfulness is great. He has not forgotten us. We may be going through a season of difficulty because of consequences of things we've done, or we may be like Job, finding ourselves surrounded by friends while we've lost our family, our fortune, our health, everything, and his friends came around him. And what did they do? They sat there for a few days silently, and they mourned quietly. Now, after a few days, those guys opened their mouths and they made all kinds of mistakes, said the wrong thing. They accused Job of sin. But at first, they got it right. They just sat quietly. We have to get better at knowing when to mourn over sin and when to mourn over tragedy, and when they're the same and when they're not the same. Some of us assume every time somebody has a hard time, it's because of sin in their life. That's not always the case. Some of us assume that every time tragedy comes into our life, it's outside our control and it's never our fault. We've got to get better at understanding when there are consequences to decisions we've made or sins that we've committed, or when it's truly just a tragedy like Job from beyond our control. And then finally, I want you to get this. Hope in the midst of mourning is what sets believers apart. It's what makes us different. And so you need to have hope in the middle of this season, but you also need to know how to have hope in the middle of mourning. You need to know how to be respectful of those who are mourning loss and pain and hurt. I do not believe the church will have a powerful witness coming out of this season of hurt in our nation if every time people are hurting, we just tell them to get over it. We just tell them to pray more. We just tell them to sing more worship songs. We just tell them to feel better. We need to know how to mourn with people and sit with people even when we don't know what to say. Too often, Christians, we want to throw a verse at somebody. And listen, there are powerful passages of Scripture that can help people, but too often we insert our opinion and say, this is the verse they need without ever praying about what to share with somebody. I have been praying with Christians in our church for years, some of them over health issues, some of them for children, some of them I've been praying for lost loved ones, some of them I've been praying for their kids who have grown up and gone wayward, gone away from the Lord, and I've been praying for years. And sometimes I know what to say, and sometimes there's not much to say. Sometimes there's a verse that is encouraging, and sometimes I just let them know I've been praying, and I put my arm around them, and I hug them. We've got to get better at mourning with people and helping people through mourning. And we have to understand that our hope is not just restoration, but restoration to God. My prayer is not that America comes out of this and we just all go back to the way things were, because the way things were was filled with anxiety, pain, divorce, kids growing up with struggles because of what they saw their parents go through, kids who were being abused. Our nation is far from where we wanted it to be before. And I don't want to just go back to where we were, but I pray that through this season, the church wouldn't just come out okay, but we'd come out closer to the Lord. I pray we don't come out arrogantly and say, well, we got through that, we can get through anything. I pray we come out saying, God is our hope. He is our refuge. And we should draw closer to him. Because money couldn't get us through that. Our freedom, our power, our political sway, whatever it is we as the church have sold our soul for, can do nothing in comparison to what God can do on our behalf. So church, and when I say church, I mean believer, I pray that through this, we'd be restored to the Lord. Some of that may mean mourning over some sin. Some of that may mean embracing hope. Some of that may mean looking to the Lord for strength and wisdom and how to comfort and help those who are hurting and mourning. But I pray we don't just become another group of people complaining about how it used to be and how we want things the way they were. I pray that we would find this as an opportunity to minister to those who are hurting, lament and mourn with those who are mourning, yet holding on to that hope. Because his mercy is new every morning. We have that hope. His love endures forever. I pray that encourages you. I pray you find hope and healing in the midst of this season. Before we close the service, I want to draw your attention to a couple of ways you can reach out. If you are mourning and hurting right now, there's a link in the description of this video. You can reach out and share your prayer request or your praise request with us, and we'd love to hear about what God is doing in your life. You can find all those links in the description. Please, please, please don't wait to reach out. This morning, I've got great news for you. We have been getting excited. Today is the final day to turn in flannel shirts for the homeless, but also we are collecting new toys for Mercy Drops to pass out to at-risk children in our community. And last week, you guys finished all the angel tree gifts have been spoken for. All the kids on the angel tree have been adopted. So these are kids whose parents are incarcerated, and these kids probably wouldn't have a very good Christmas this year unless somebody adopts them and buys the gifts on their list. And the lists are not full of PS5s and new shoes. Most of the lists would break your heart. Some of them are asking for clothes, a jacket to wear to school, a new pair of jeans because they don't have anything to wear. These lists were heartbreaking. In our church, man, we took all those lists, and now you're buying those gifts. So thank you, church, for being generous. And as a result of your generosity, last week a family had their house burned down. We were able to step in financially and help them. There's all the needs I don't have time to go through, but there have been needs this holiday season that we've been able to step in the gap financially for some people, and that's because of your generosity and giving. So if you'd like to give this morning, of course, you can click the link in the description. You can also give at restore.church/give, as well as texting any amount to the number on the screen, and you'll follow the prompts, and they'll take care of all the registration. But we love being generous in our community, but our church is only as generous as the people in our church. So church, when we're generous, we can be generous. When you and I are stingy with our finances, then our church has less to pull from to be generous in our community through missions, church planting, and reaching people with the gospel through the resources God has given us. So church, we've made it through another Sunday online. We love you. Some of you, man, we haven't seen you since March. We miss seeing you. We've gone outdoors all this time. Our kids ministry is indoors. Our student ministry has moved indoors, and we have begun meeting with some of our leaders indoors for a partial indoor service that is not open to the public, but just for our leaders and team members. And in January, we'll be making some more changes and adjustments as we move the outdoor service time later in the day as it begins to be cooler in the morning. And our indoor service will be open to the public, but we'll make all those announcements after Christmas. The last thing I'm going to tell you about is our Christmas Eve service. We're excited this year, and we're praying for good weather because we're going to have an outdoor Christmas Eve service as well as an indoor Christmas Eve service. This will be our first indoor service open to the public since March. And of course, we'll have mask requirements and social distancing, and the chairs will be all spaced apart. But we're excited about this as an opportunity to have an outreach for our community, to sing some Christmas carols around the candlelit, as well as a very short service. We've always had a very short Christmas Eve service, so we believe we can do it safely. We believe we can do it in a way that honors the Lord and encourages the community as well as the believers. So, church, I love you. I miss you. We're praying for you. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next Sunday.